오늘은 저희 특별히 이제 그 달루지 유니버시티에서 데이비드 블랙 교수님이 오셨는데, 저는 개인적으로 이제 박사 공부하면서부터 많이 저 혼자만 많이 뵀던 분이고요. 이제 미들 파워 컨셉 같은 것도 많이 연구를 하셨고, 그리고 스포츠 ODA, 문화 ODA 이런 연구를 최근에 많이 하고 계시고, 그 중에서도 특히 이제 젠지에 대해서 관심을 많이 가지고 연구를 하고 계십니다.
Thank you all for coming today. I was asked about the possibility of talking about Gen Z in Africa, and I thought the one dimension of this that I feel most able to address is the so-called born-free generation in South Africa, who are those South Africans who were born essentially after the transition from apartheid rule to majority rule in 1994. So it roughly aligns with Gen Z, a little bit crosses over to the millennial generation. And this is to make an argument that the splintering of South Africa's born-free generation reflects growing cultural, socioeconomic, and political, as well as persistent racial divisions. There is, in a sense, no coherent born-free generation, even though we often talk as if there is. This is actually a group of South Africans that has become more diffuse in its orientation towards democratic political life, and therefore has become this growing disparate or diversity in the experience of born-free South Africans is actually having quite profound consequences for democratic sustainment, because they are becoming increasingly alienated for a variety of different reasons from the political process. And this matters not just for South Africa, but it matters for Africa, because South Africa is, in the end, a fundamentally important part of the future of the African continent, and has its ability to sustain a viable democratic practice is important, not just for its own sake, but for others as well. First of all, I want to situate the experience of the born-frees in relation to a much longer tradition of youth activism in South African politics. If there is a distinguishing feature of Black South African youth, it is that they have been continuously at the vanguard of struggles for change in South Africa, and the way those struggles unfold has a huge bearing on the kind of political transitions that have taken place. I want to then talk about what they're reacting against, which is a kind of antagonism towards the rainbow ideal in South Africa, the post-apartheid idea that South Africa, in the wake of the 1994 miracle, could become a harmonious, multi-ethnic, multiracial, democratic society. And what we are seeing from the mid-2010s onwards is a strong reaction against the idea of rainbowism and rainbow reformism. And that has manifested concretely in what people call fallism, which is started with roads must fall, and then extended to fees must fall, became a kind of countrywide social movement amongst young Black South Africans. And then I want to talk, though, about how that element of struggle coexists with extraordinarily diverse array of people who populate the same demographic cohort. So there are many Black South Africans who are experiencing extreme marginalization, who don't have the same structural interests as the fallists, as it were. And there is another segment which has become part of the new elite in South Africa at the apex of wealth and power. And so this is a challenge in terms of a coherent way forward. And then I'm going to connect this to this trend towards youth disengagement in political life in South Africa and whether there is a viable way forward. And it really goes to some things that we were talking about earlier, in the sense that there is a strong push for a more fully and comprehensively decolonized future in South Africa, and how that push, how that will be responded to, will have a huge bearing on what might emerge from the current moment of uncertainty in South Africa. I wanted to start with a story. I've been going to South Africa semi-regularly since 1989, and I've which is mostly a reflection on how old I am. But it's very interesting to interact with people over a succession of periods of time. And on my last trip, which was in 2024, I was staying at a guest house in an inner suburb of Johannesburg, and one of the other guests, there were a lot of long-term guests there, was a young man, a young African man, about 27, 28 years old. And we got to know each other. And this young fellow is actually an embodiment of the promise of the new South Africa. He grew up in a high-density township outside of the capital of Mpumalanga province. He grew up in a single mother-headed household. Most of his friends didn't finish high school. Most of his friends are struggling to find employment, but he had a really strict mother who insisted on that her kids were going to succeed academically. He got through matriculation. He went to the University of Pretoria to study engineering, really struggled the first couple of years, but succeeded in completing a civil engineering degree, and had now been working as a kind of property manager for a company in Johannesburg for a number of years. And all of which is to say, this is the kind of embodiment of what people hoped the promise of the new South Africa would hold. And when it came to talking about politics, he said he had been, by this time, able to vote in 4 national elections, 4 elections for the national government and 4 city elections. And every time he had gone to the polling station to cast his vote, and every time he'd got there, looked at the ballot and said, I can't vote for any of these people, and walked away. He had never voted. 4 times to the station, never voted. And that is, I think, a manifestation of the deep sense of frustration and alienation that many young South Africans are experiencing. The crux of the problem and the way that they're reacting to it are varied, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. Just because I don't know how much you know about South Africa, but I thought it would be useful to just give you a very quick primer on this fascinating country. South Africa is still Africa's largest economy by GDP, not by purchasing power parity, but by GDP, by a significant margin. So it's an important economy. It has relatively sophisticated corporate structures and infrastructure and technology, with relatively strong institutions, including universities, think tanks, and the like, and relatively robust infrastructure. So it stands out in the African context as a kind of potential anchor. And the reason it has these advantages is that these were built through hundreds of years of settler colonization and exploitation of the black majority. So this is the strength of South Africa that rests on this foundation of dispossession and injustice. And that's the crux of the kind of challenge that was built to serve the interests of the white settler minority in South Africa. After decades of struggle by black South Africans, the country succeeded in negotiating a transition to majority rule in 1994. But despite over 30 years of political freedom and democracy, it remains the most unequal country in the world. So the socioeconomic disparities which is pretty striking achievement, if you like, if you could call it that. It is still a multiracial country, but with a steadily growing African majority. And while there has been real progress on many fronts, there is also this deep sense of disappointment amongst, especially this born-free generation that feels that those who struggled for liberation, they owe nothing to them. So this just gives you a kind of demographic breakdown. The population of South Africa is now more than 80% African. There are 4 other, and it's interesting that this is still an artifact of the old order too, that South Africans still measure their identity in relation to these apartheid era identity groups, so colored or so-called mixed race. South Africans are the next biggest group at just under 10%. They used to be smaller than the white population, now are larger than the white population in terms of percentage. About 7.5% are white South Africans who still enjoy tremendous wealth and prosperity and privilege in the South African context, but have a deep sense of anxiety about the future themselves. And then there is the Asian population, mainly the descendants of Indian sharecroppers who have been disproportionately impactful. They're just under 3% of the population, but they have had an enormous impact in terms of intellectual life, in terms of their role in the politics of struggle in South Africa. So a small but significant group. Who are the born frees? I've talked a little bit about this already. South Africans born after or close to the end of apartheid rule and the beginning of non-racial democracy. They are, by definition, those South Africans that were historically disenfranchised. So they're born free, as opposed to all of their predecessors who had been born in various degrees of subordination. They, as I said, substantially but not completely overlap with Gen Z, but in the South African context, born free matters a lot more than the Gen Z identity or Gen Z label. And they, as I've already said, became associated with this upsurge in protest from 2005 onwards. But they need to be understood as part of this long heritage of struggle. And there's some images from the historical eras. Whenever South Africa experienced an upsurge in resistance against the white minority that was ruling them, the impetus came from the youth. So in the 1940s and 1950s, the ANC Youth League emerged to push the African National Congress, which had always been a relatively moderate anti-apartheid organization engaged in peaceful protest, pushed them towards a much more radical position, ultimately leading to the decision to adopt armed struggle with Nelson Mandela as the head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. And so that was the kind of the first phase of radicalization, which was suppressed as a consequence of the rise of the Pan-Africanist Congress and the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960. And after that period of repression and the banning of the ANC and the PAC and the imprisonment of Mandela and many others, that early generation of leadership, the country was able to lock down resistance for a period of time. But it was again the youth that led the push to re-radicalize the struggle for change in 1976 with the Soweto uprisings, and uprisings that were uprisings against the imposition of Afrikaans, the language of the Afrikaner white majority in South Africa, as the language of instruction for South African school children. So school children that took to the streets, and on June 16th of 1976, 160 of them were massacred protesting in Soweto, in the southwest townships of Johannesburg, and that unleashed a year of nationwide unrest. Many of that generation went into exile, joined the armed struggle. Many others, so in this period of time, many others boycotted schools and protested continuously. There was really no relief from that. It spilled over in the 1980s and to the mass democratic movement and the United Democratic Movement, which was the kind of final push with, again, young South Africans very much at the forefront of that struggle. And I think that the key point is that if there is a common thread through youth culture in South Africa, it is this propensity to resist, this propensity for activism, and this propensity when they feel deep injustices are being imposed to rise up and to make. One of the things I've said many times is that one thing that South Africans know how to do is to make their country ungovernable when the occasion warrants it. The other consequence, especially of the 1970s, that's really important and that has had long-term, very negative repercussions, is that the schools have never really worked properly. The public education system has never really worked properly since the mid-1970s. And as a result, the level of the quality of teaching, the quality of facilities, the capacity to succeed in public education has throughout the years of the post-apartheid era failed to catch up with the needs of the country, so that matriculation rates, about 50% of those who start school in the public education system actually reach the end of high school, and of those, about 80% now matriculate, but they matriculate at a rate of 30%. The pass rate is 30%, more or less. So it is a low quality education, and it means it's very difficult to get into both the university system and the job market on the basis of the training that the public education system is delivering. So all of this comes to an apparently happy ending in 1994, the sort of miracle of negotiated transition in South Africa that unfolded between 1990 and 1994. One of the misapprehensions about this process is that this was a peaceful negotiated transition. The negotiations, of course, were nonviolent, but they took place in an atmosphere of very widespread violence in the country as a whole. So it was a very difficult set of negotiations, but at the end of it, there was an agreement to establish a multiracial, universal democratic franchise for all South Africans. So this is political decolonization that finally took place. And it was, in fact, the firebrands of the ANC Youth League to a large degree, Nelson Mandela, Govan Mbeki, and others of that generation that were the architects in many ways, or at least the spiritual leaders of this transition, which placed at its core the priority of reconciliation across racial boundaries. And that was the essence of rainbowism, was that the idea that South Africa could be a democratic home for people of all racial backgrounds. And so the prioritization of Mandela and those closest to him was political freedom and racial reconciliation. And a phrase that I really like from the novelist Andre Brink was that what he said he experienced, and others, millions and millions of others of South Africans experienced in April 1994, was an electoral epiphany, a spiritual kind of experience where he wrote a beautiful article at the time about being in the lineup with people of every race for hours, 85% of South Africans voting in this moment, and the governing ANC had at this initial time recognized clearly that the need to deliver, as the slogan went, a better life for all, and adopted as its initial approach to doing this a policy called the Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP, which was essentially a social democratic, redistributive, reformist kind of program that the kind of catch slogan for was growth through redistribution. So growth would be built on a foundation of redistributing wealth to those who had been deprived of it historically. So it was that kind of a program that they put in place. The country was relieved, and in many ways there was a really interesting, one of the interesting things that happened from an academic perspective is that young South Africans stopped studying history. In this particular moment, there was a huge decline in enrollments in history departments because history departments had become the locus of politicization in the university system, and people just didn't want to think or talk about politics. They'd been engaged in it so intensively for such a long period of time. They just wanted to turn the page on that and move forward. And they were also anxious to explore the new opportunities that the new dispensation did create for them. And they were genuinely grateful to the ANC for delivering liberation and respectful of the reconciliation politics of Nelson Mandela, of Madiba, as he was affectionately known. There were other follow-ups to promote reconciliation, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a very intensive multi-year process under the leadership of Desmond Tutu, the Bishop of Cape Town. The key point here is that the Truth and Reconciliation focused on the crimes of individual culpability for crimes in the course of the pursuit of apartheid policies, rather than focusing on the structural, the structures that had ensured impoverishment and marginalization. So corporate structures, educational structures, the institutionalized structures of the apartheid state that were really responsible for run-of-the-mill, everyday deprivation for the majority of South Africans, rather than the extreme atrocities that were investigated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Not unimportant, but not getting at the structural underpinnings of inequality in South Africa. And a really pivotal early step, which commentators still struggle to try to understand, is that the South African government, only 2 years after taking office, shifted from the RDP to the Growth, Employment, and Reconstruction Strategy, the GEAR strategy, which was essentially a shift from a social democratic, redistributive approach to building a new South Africa to a neoliberal approach that sought to promote growth, redistribution through growth, right? So growth first, and the program, the way in which a better life for all was manifested under this new rubric was broad-based black economic empowerment, BBBEE, which was essentially affirmative action for a small number of South Africans that could then find their way into the senior reaches of the corporate structure in South Africa. So it was a shift from a more state-led, redistributive approach to a more market-led, growth, capitalist, neoliberal approach. Quite why that happened is an interesting puzzle. It seems to have been dreamed up by a very small cadre of people close to Mandela. Mandela himself, I think was more, anyway. So we can engage in the parlor game of understanding why this happened, but it did quite quickly. I think there was huge pressure from the World Bank and other groups, and South Africa was short of the capacity to resist that pressure at the time. But that became a fundamental turning point that probably wasn't as appreciated as fully at the time as it might have been. It's not that nothing changed, right? That there was in this first decade and a half, really until about 2010, improvements for most black South Africans. Some of them products of the RDP. People talk about RDP houses, thousands of houses that were small houses that were decent, that were built for people, but also opportunities in the economy through BBE, through Black Economic Empowerment, BEE I should say, which led to the emergence of a small number of super rich Africans, who happened to include, by the way, the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who moved from being a trade unionist and leader of the negotiations. This became a source of good, stable jobs, jobs that could also be used to reward loyal party cadres of the African National Congress. So it led to the emergence of a new black middle class, a middle class that was at a lower average wage than the white middle class, but that nevertheless had achieved a degree of prosperity that was unprecedented, but that affected really about 7% of the black population of South Africa. Really, by about a decade into this experiment, the improvements for a significant number of South Africans were being overshadowed by the growing inequalities that this order had generated. So in the way it was conceptualized by Oyedemi, successful political decolonization was not accompanied by the harder work of socioeconomic or cultural decolonization. So it's as hard as political decolonization is, it's the easy part when we're talking about getting at these underlying socioeconomic and cultural structures. So this paved the way for the Born Frees and the emergence of the Fallist movement in about 2015 to 2017. The Born Frees felt no debt to those who had delivered freedom. I remember talking to a disability rights activist, actually, who was an ANC cadre, who said, he tries to explain to it. He became disabled in a student protest when he was shot in the back, and he tried to explain to his son, what they had done and why this was such an important struggle. And his son, he said, my son just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand why that should matter to him in the world that he now occupies. It really crystallized amongst university students, first at University of Cape Town, where I remember this monumental statue of Cecil John Rhodes, who was the arch imperialist at the center of the UCT campus, and students finally said, "This is garbage. This is, this has to go. This is a symbol of everything that was wrong with our history," and that led to a mobilization at UCT that spread countrywide and became a struggle against the things that were preventing black South Africans from having access to and the ability to succeed in higher education. They were the focus of anger was the need for change in curriculum and the structure of the faculty, the relative underrepresentation of African South Africans among student bodies, even though there were many more African South Africans in universities than there had been previously. Their rate of participation was about 5% of the total African population, as opposed to 20% of white or Indian South Africans. So they were substantially underrepresented, and because many of them lived in conditions of relative deprivation, it was more difficult to succeed. They had longer to travel. The burden of paying these fees was higher. So these were the kinds of issues that were at the forefront of the protests. They were, but that was the proximate focus of the protests. But it was about, in the end, much more than that. It became a much more far-reaching kind of critique of what was going on in South Africa. They were frustrated and impatient with diminishing opportunities and the failure of the state to deliver meaningful change for the majority. So this is about the growing disaffection with a state that had become a sinecure for well-connected cadres of the party, rather than actually a capable way of delivering the public policies that were so desperately needed. In party political terms, it manifested in diminishing participation overall, but also steadily declining support for the ANC, which up to that time had been the ruling party in a one-party dominant political system, and a gravitation towards the economic freedom fighters, the EFF, the orange-overalled opposition group that was led paradoxically by a former head of the ANC Youth League, but that's a story for another day. And blame was directed principally at excessive accommodations for white South Africans and the persistence of settler colonial privilege. So this was a decolonial critique of the way in which the privileging of reconciliation had led to but this group, the Fallist activists, are only one relatively small segment of the total span of born free South Africans, and I think that's really important. In fact, the lived experience of African South Africans has become much more diverse in the post-apartheid period than it was historically. So at the top you have what people colloquially call the black diamonds, those who are really the children of the prime beneficiaries of black economic empowerment, who live super rich lives. There are extraordinarily rich African South Africans now that would never have been possible in the past. This was mirrored at the other end. Sorry, this is there was this large number of African South Africans who hadn't completed school, weren't able to get into the job market. Unemployment rates now running at around 60% of young South Africans who were living with deep uncertainty and frustration, but really had relatively little in common with the relatively elite students who were able to get into university and begin to at least start to climb up the ladder. Now, it has to be said that in the first decade after the end of apartheid, getting a university degree was a ticket to a better future. By this time, by the mid-2010s, it was no longer the case. The prospects, because South Africa was dealing with structural unemployment across the board, were much less reliable than they had been. The opportunities were much less reliable. One of the interesting consequences of this, from a very parochial perspective, it was almost impossible to retain African South African in university employment because they didn't get paid enough. People would move into the private sector or they would move into the public sector, but they wouldn't stay in universities. Now we're seeing many more African South Africans take and stay in academic positions, which is a really good thing, but it's happening for a kind of bad reason because of the shrinking structure of opportunities. Just move quickly. So there's this, the other way in which this manifests is in terms of electoral participation. There's been a steady decline in youth participation in formal political processes. In the last 2024 election, the growing disaffection with the ANC was manifested in the fact that they won, for the first time, less than 50%, only 40% of the popular vote. So we're now headed into a new era of coalition politics in South Africa. There were only 55% of voters under 39 actually registered to vote, and of those, only 47% actually voted. So this is back to my friend at the guest house and the growing absence of participation. Okay. I'm going to make two other points before I stop talking. Point one is, of course, we've been focusing, when we focus on the born frees, on African South Africans, but there are still these other groups, these youth demographics, white South Africans, colored South Africans, Asian South Africans. And the question becomes, can one move towards a more fully decolonized South Africa that also makes an accommodation or manages to retain the emphasis on cross-racial cooperation and cross-racial kind of future? And there are moments, anybody who's spent time in South Africa can talk about moments where you see what is achievable if it's possible to sustain, promote, and enable these kinds of synergies when you bring all South Africans together. I have a Springbok rugby cap, which some people say is a manifestation of this, insofar as a fully multiracial South African rugby team has become indomitable in the world. However, it's worth noting that it's only about 30% of the rugby side that is actually black in this new era. But at any rate, so there's this question of can the process of decolonization be negotiated in such a way that it makes possible the accommodation of all South Africans? And that's, for white South Africans, there's a very shallow and contingent future. They've never been better off, really, than they are in material terms, but they also feel deeply uncertain about the future. And many have been essentially advised in their schools to plan for a move to some other part of the world. And we're seeing still significant current of emigration. The other part of decolonization is South Africa's relationship with Africans outside of South Africa. This has always been a profound challenge. It's the phrase that I heard early on that always struck me as apt was that South Africans don't live with Africa, they live up against Africa. And there are many, many Africans who, as tough as times are in South Africa, have sought refuge in South Africa for a variety of reasons. And whenever populist fervor gets whipped up, there are outbursts of xenophobic violence towards African South Africans. So how is it possible for this decolonization to also be one that encompasses a view of South Africa that is fully integrated in the Africa of the future? And so those are our key critical questions to look forward to. The Born Free push, so some implications. The Born Free push for more comprehensive decolonization needs to persist, but the question is, can it be combined with a more permissive and accommodating orientation towards others in their midst, other racial others and non-South African others in their midst, which are deeply interwoven in the fabric of South African society. South African governments need to urgently grasp the nettle of improving public education. This is a decades-old challenge that has been avoided for a whole series of mostly political reasons that somehow has to be wrestled to the ground. And more broadly, the emphasis on decolonization has to also be combined with an emphasis on probity and effectiveness in the delivery of public services. You need to focus on the nuts and bolts of improved public administration, and there needs to be finally a comprehensive national project to address the deep and widening inequalities, which is effectively the next stage of liberation. I'll stop there.